Module 5.4 will discuss disaster risk reduction and anticipatory action. What is disaster risk reduction? Disaster risk reduction, or DRR, is an approach to identifying, assessing, and reducing the risks of natural hazards or disasters. DRR focuses on natural hazards like extreme weather events, but also on other hazards, so geophysical hazards like volcanoes and earthquakes, biological hazards such as epidemics or invasive species, technological hazards such as oil spills or dam failures, and even societal hazards such as conflict and economic shocks. As DRR is often in relation to a risk that may be outside of human control, such as an earthquake, DRR focuses on reducing or managing the conditions of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, as can be seen in this risk equation. So by reducing or managing these factors that are within human control, the intention is to reduce the overall risk, prevent losses, and alleviate impacts. Disaster risk reduction may seem very similar to climate change adaptation, and that's because they do have similarities. Both fields try to identify, reduce, or mitigate the risks, sometimes by improving the societal response to hazards. And they both address some of the same hazards. So for example, extreme weather, such as floods and hurricanes, because climate change increases the frequency and intensity of natural hazards. However, adaptation and DRR do have differences. Climate change adaptation focuses on gradual, long-term processes that are caused by climate change, so sea level rise, whereas DRR focuses on both short and long-term natural hazards. And remember, we said hazards can be like landslides and earthquakes, as well as technological hazards and even societal hazards. The goal of adaptation is to adapt to specific changes in the environment caused by climate change, so i.e. to adapt to 1.5 degree warmer worlds. Whereas the goal of DRR is to mitigate the impacts of a hazard, sometimes a specific event that may not have long-term consequences or involve transforming aspects of our society. Finally, adaptation addresses large-scale changes to the environment, whereas DRR responds to both small and large-scale hazards. Let's explore a strategy of disaster risk reduction known as anticipatory action. This strategy uses weather forecasts to trigger anticipatory action, which releases humanitarian funds before an event occurs to reduce the impact of the impending hazard. Anticipatory action has been implemented by various organizations around the world, including the Red Cross, the World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Anticipatory action as a strategy has many benefits, including it's a more efficient use of time and money. It can preserve displacement, disease, loss of livelihoods and lives. It can preserve the dignity of those affected. Early intervention can also provide benefits beyond relief from the immediate impacts by helping to protect development gains in the long term. And anticipatory action involves greater coordination and community participation, which overall can increase resilience. Let's look at a graphic explaining how anticipatory action would play out in real life. On this graph, the x-axis at the bottom is time, and the y-axis is humanitarian needs. We would begin at this point on the graph with an anticipatory action plan that includes a set of pre-agreed actions, pre-committed financing, and the trigger or parameters for action. So we would know what actions, what money is allocated, and what the trigger threshold is. So we would be tracking the forecasts and looking out for an early warning sign that might indicate that we are reaching a trigger threshold. Let's say we reach a trigger threshold. For example, a predicted wind speed on a certain magnitude that would indicate an approaching storm. This trigger would release the anticipatory actions, which could be the necessary funds to begin anticipatory action activities, with a particular emphasis on the most vulnerable. So at this point, humanitarian aid is provided, for example, distribution of provisions or cash, evacuations, or reinforcement of structures. Depending on the nature of the hazard and forecasting capabilities, interventions can be made well ahead of the shock or event, or at least earlier than the traditional humanitarian response. So as we can see on the graph, the blue line is representing the anticipatory action and results in lower humanitarian needs after the shock event. And as you can see, anticipatory action would just maybe hover around humanitarian crisis, but would not last in this crisis mode for too long and would be able to recover. The red line is showing the traditional response, and as we can see, after the shock event, there is a very large spike in humanitarian needs. We enter the humanitarian crisis zone. Humanitarian aid is provided after the shock, and it takes longer to recover, and we are in the humanitarian crisis zone for a lot longer than compared to anticipatory action. We can also see based on this graph that the humanitarian aid provided after the event in the traditional response was overall less effective than if the humanitarian aid was provided before the shock event. Anticipatory action is a very specific, predefined intervention. Anticipatory action is implemented between when the hazard is forecasted and the impacts are observed. Anticipatory action are actions taken based on a defined threshold from the forecast and a risk analysis, and they aim to prevent or mitigate the negative impacts of the forecasted hazard. Anticipatory action is not preparedness or readiness activities. It isn't an intervention that relies on post-shock or after the event assessment to evaluate humanitarian needs. And it's not a multi-year intervention to reduce chronic vulnerability or long-term vulnerability to hazard risk. What are the key elements needed for planning an anticipatory action strategy? Step 1 involves determining the forecast threshold triggers for the hazards. Relevant government ministries and national and regional meteorological agencies would come together and agree on a forecast trigger for key climate hazards. As an example, let's say a region is exposed to tropical cyclones. For the forecast threshold, we might consider wind speed, lead time, probability, or existing hurricane watch or warnings. We would decide on a trigger value after which the anticipatory action would be released in anticipation of a shock event. We need to keep in mind that triggers should give sufficient time for actions to be taken to support people at risk and so they can prepare for the impact. Step 2 would be to agree on the anticipatory actions. So figure out the anticipatory actions, the costs attached, and the respective coordination mechanisms. Potential actions could be transferring money to pre-identified vulnerable people so they can restock food or water or reinforce their houses, to provide specific support for people during evacuations, and topping up social assistance payments. Step 3 is to strengthen social protection systems. So we want to identify those most vulnerable and collect data to understand how we can best support them, and then strengthen those methods to provide support. So this step could include delivery and information management systems and vulnerability data, deciding on contingency plans, and testing new disbursement procedures such as a digital wallet so people can receive cash transfers. Step 4 is to approve the anticipatory action plan with the above information. And this stage may also include securing contingency funds prior to the hazard, so ensuring the funds available for the anticipatory action are obtained and ready to go. And then step 5 is to put the plan in place and to begin to monitor the forecast. And again, to reiterate, once the forecast is being monitored and a trigger is reached, the trigger will enable a transfer of funds to the respective government ministry, which will then be channeled through the social protection system directly to vulnerable people and households at risk to help them be resilient and prepare for the impact. We have now reached the end of our Fundamentals of Climate Change and Infrastructure course. We hope you enjoyed all of the modules and have learned some new concepts that you can share with others or use in your work or day-to-day life. We would like to say thank you, bedankt, for participating in this course, and before we finish, quickly remind you to finish all course quizzes before October 13th, 2023 if you would like to receive a certificate of participation for this course.